Dear students, in this lesson, we will be giving you the basic aspects of kinship. We explain the significance of kinship in social life. We then define the basic concepts of kinship. These include the concepts of descent, inheritance, residence rules, and so on. Next, we take up descent systems, including the patrilineal and the matrilineal systems. Finally, we deal with kinship modes in India. This lesson provides a broad idea about the concept of kinship. Significance of kinship. The kinship system refers to a set of persons recognized as relatives either by virtue of blood relationship, technically called consanguinity, or by virtue of marriage relationship, that is through what is called affinity. Most of us tend to regard the kinship system into which we are born and in which we are reared as natural. It will seem natural and right to us that certain close relatives should be tabooed as marriage and sexual partners, and we feel quite certain that disastrous consequences would follow any infringement of the taboos. We may similarly think it natural that certain classes of persons be preferred as marriage partners, or we may, on the contrary, think it very unnatural that any persons be so designated. We all have very strong ideas too about what is the correct and proper behavior of different kin towards each other: deference, respect, familiarity, avoidance, kindliness, protectiveness, and so on, as the case may be. All such aspects of kinship relations tend to be taken for granted unless or until one is confronted with the kinship practices of other peoples. Initially, different practices may appear as disgusting or inhuman, exotic or fantastic, strange or primitive, etc. Earlier, sociologists spent a great deal of labor on trying to work out the various stages through which they believed kinship systems had progressed in the course of human history. However, strange other people's kinship practices may at first appear to be a closer look. We usually show them to be functional. They are useful for the maintenance of the society as a whole, contributing to its continuity over time and containing the conflicts that might potentially disrupt it. This is not to say that all practices are for the best for all members of the society and for all time. One certainly need not justify customs like sati, female infanticide, child marriage, amniocentesis, or killing of the female fetus, etc. One would here try to understand how these practices are consistent with the principles and values at work in the wider society. Basic concepts of kinship. We have already made the general point that kinship relations are the outcome of the cultural interpretation of relations given in nature and discussed some of the different ways in which sociologists have looked at the kinship system. In doing so, we have indirectly introduced some of the basic terms and concepts in kinship studies, which we will now set out more systematically. You certainly do not need to memorize this rather overwhelming set of technical terms, but you should try to understand the basic principles and distinctions that these key terms seek to convey. The principles of descent. Descent is the principle whereby a child is socially affiliated with a group of his or her parents. In some societies, the child is regarded as a descendant equally of both the father and the mother, except that titles and surnames are usually passed down along the male line. Such a system is termed bilateral or cognitive. The individual belongs simultaneously to several descent groups. those of the two parents, the four grandparents, the 8 great-grandparents, and so on. This link is limited only by memory or by some conventionally determined cutoff point at, say, 4 or 5 degrees removal. In small intermarrying communities, membership will probably overlap, and in case of dispute or feud, the individual might find his or her loyalties divided. There are some cognitive systems where the individual has the right by descent to membership of several cognitively recruited groups, but this right is actualized only if the person is able to reside in a particular group's territory. Modern nationality laws often make this type of requirement. Types of descent. In other societies, by contrast, and your own is most probably one of them, descent is reckoned unilinear, that is, in one line only. The child is affiliated either with the group of the father, that is patrilineal descent, or with the group of mother, that is matrilineal descent. Theories of the physiology of procreation and conception often correlate with these different modes of reckoning descent. The father is often given the primary role in procreation, while the mother is regarded as merely the carrier of the child. In systems of the latter type, the father's role may not be acknowledged at all. Additionally, in some societies, one finds that the child is affiliated to the group of either parent, depending on choice, or to one parent for some purposes, for instance, inheritance of property, and to the other parent for other purposes, for instance, the inheritance of ritual or ceremonial roles. This is called double unilineal descent. The principle of unilineal descent provides the individual an unambiguous identification with a bounded social group that exists before he or she is born and that has continuity after he or she dies. Members of a descent group have a sense of shared identity, often referring to each other as brother and sister, even when no genealogical relationship can be traced. Descent groups are also very often, though not inevitably, characterized by exogamy. That is, marriage must be with persons outside this group. For instance, traditional Chinese society was divided among approximately 100 surname groups. You could perhaps call them clans, within which marriage was disallowed, and these groups further divided into lineages whose members claimed to be able to trace their descent perhaps for several hundred years from a founding ancestor, and then into further localized sub-lineages, and so on down to the individual co-resident families. Sometimes a whole village might be settled by members of a single lineage. The Gotras of Indian caste society are also exogamous descent groups, segmented in rather the same way. Functions of descent groups. Apart from the function of exogamy, unilineal descent groups tend to be corporate in several other senses. Their members may often come together for ritual and ceremonial functions. For instance, for collective worship of lineage gods, totems, or ancestors. The descent group will have a built-in authority structure with power normally exercised by senior males, and it may well own corporate property. An individual's economic rights and responsibilities will be defined by his or her position in the descent group. In many societies, unilineal descent groups are also jural units, internally deciding their own disputes and externally acting as a unified group in the conduct of feud, etc. For this reason, lineage structure is often coterminous with the political structure in societies lacking a centralized state structure. Lineages cannot expand indefinitely in a single locality and often segment into smaller, more manageable and economically viable lineage segments. You can see the lines of segmentation of the ground, as it were. Consider the pattern of land ownership in an Indian village or at the pattern of village or urban settlement. A particular quarter of the village or town may be inhabited by the descendants of a single founding ancestor. Often, the large havelis divide among brothers or stepbrothers, and these quarters are further divided among their descendants. In case a line dies out, the property would be reconsolidated. Given the range of social functions that descent groups may potentially perform, it is little wonder that concern with the principles of unilineal descent has dominated the work of many students of comparative kinship. However, even these scholars realize that unilineal descent is not the whole story. In ancient Rome, women after marriage served all contact with their natal group. In certain slave societies, the slave has no family of his or her own. In patrilineal systems, the mother's father, mother's sister, and especially the mother's brother are important relationships which need further discussion. To take note of the importance of relationships, the scholars have identified another principle. This has been termed the principle of complementary filiation, which explains the significant ritual and social roles of the mother's brother in the lives of their sister's children. It reminds us that in most societies, an individual is a child of both parents. However, descent is formally reckoned. Inheritance rules. Rules of inheritance tend to coordinate with the reckoning of descent in most societies, but not necessarily in a one-to-one manner. In fact, it is quite often the case that certain types of property pass from father to son and other types from mother to daughter. In most parts of India in the past, immovable property such as land and housing was inherited only by sons. In the absence of sons, except under rare circumstances, by the nearest male relatives on the father's side. On the other hand, movable property in the form of cash and jewelry was given to the daughter at the time of her marriage, with a certain amount of jewelry also passing from the mother-in-law to the daughter-in-law. In addition to property of various kinds, rights and obligations, esoteric knowledge, crafts and skills, etc., might be passed on in accordance with the kinship roles, succession to office to chieftainship, kingship, etc., and to other social roles and statuses. It is also very often determined by kinship criteria. In such cases, the individual status is said to be ascribed, not achieved. It is commonly asserted that ascriptive status of modern industrial societies. There is a great deal of truth in the statement, but one should not underestimate the importance of kinship connections in modern societies too. Often, one finds that in a family, if father is a doctor or lawyer, the son or daughter is also likely to choose the same occupation. Most of the Indian women who have been successful in the political domain are either daughters, sisters, or wives of people who have been active in politics. One such example is the Nehru family of India. Rules of residence. Rules of residence, meaning residence after marriage, are an important variable in a kinship system and substantially affect the quality of personal relations within the kin network. If husband and wife set up their own independent home after marriage, as is usually the case in modern Western society, residence is said to be neolocal, where the wife goes to live with the husband in his parents' home. Residence is described as virilocal, patrilocal, or patrivirilocal, and where the husband moves to live with the wife, it is termed matrilocal, or rules of residence may or may not harmonize with the rules of descent. On the whole, patrilineal descent systems correlate with either neolocal or patrivirilocal residence patterns. However, matrilineal descent systems may be combined with all three types of residence. It is also combined with what is called avunculocal residence, that is, residence with the mother's brother. Patriarchy and matriarchy A society is said to have a patriarchal structure when a number of factors coincide. That is, when descent is reckoned patrilineally, when inheritance of major property is from father to son, when residence is patrilocal, and when authority is concentrated in the hands of senior males. There is, however, no society on earth, nor any society actually known to have existed, whose features are the exact reverse of these. For even in matrilineal, matrilocal systems, which are fairly rare, major property is usually controlled by males, and authority is normally exercised by males, though women may well have a higher status in the family and greater powers of decision making than in the patriarchal setup. Some sociologists assert that in societies with very simple technology and minimal property, relations between the sexes are relatively egalitarian. Whether descent is formally matrilineal, patrilineal, or bilateral, but others insist that women and children have played subordinate roles in all human societies. For this reason, the term matriarchy, though often found in the literature, is probably a misnomer best avoided, and there is certainly no conclusive evidence to support the view that matriarchy was a universal early stage in the development of kinship systems. Descent systems further details. The patrilineal descent systems of India have many of the features noted in similar groups elsewhere. A boy at birth becomes a member of his descent group and a corpusina partner in a joint estate. A girl, by contrast, is only a residual member of her natal group. At marriage, she is incorporated into her husband's descent group and ultimately, that is, after her death, offered worship by their male descendants. Residence, as we have already noted, is usually patrilineal. The descent group may participate in joint rituals, certain deities, and ancestor worship, and will observe mourning restrictions in various degrees following a death in the family. It may also own a certain amount of common property. Immovable property, such as land and housing, is inherited in the male line only. Of course, we are speaking here of the traditional system before the several changes sought to be brought about by post-independence legislation. Whereas daughters are given boots, cash, and jewelry as dowry at the time of marriage. The descent group has an inbuilt authority structure based on generation and age. Senior members have the authority to settle disputes within the kin group and to represent the group in its dealing with outsiders. Patrilineal descent. Taken together, the above-mentioned features approach the patriarchal model of society. This has patrilineal descent, patrilocal residence, inheritance from father to son, and authority in the hands of seniors as against juniors and males as against females. A number of social practices testify to the fact that a woman's only legitimate roles are those of wife and mother. Spinsterhood and widowhood are inauspicious and unviable conditions. A girl is regarded as merely a guest in her natal home, and initially at least as a rather threatening outsider in her marital home. The poignancy of the transition between these two locales and these two statuses is captured in folklore and folk songs with which you are probably familiar. The patrilineal systems of the South are not so markedly patriarchal as those of the North. Also, a woman after marriage continues to have materially and psychologically important relations with members of her natal group. This is more so with her parents and her brothers, and the residual right to maintenance in their estate in adverse circumstances. And in many other patrilineal systems, the mother's brothers have significant ritual and social roles in the lives of their sisters' children and an especially tender and affectionate relationship with them. Further modifying the starkly patriarchal picture, a number of sociologists, speaking comparatively, have also drawn attention to the fairly substantial property that devolves on a daughter at her marriage. Others, however, insist that this property cannot be considered as a daughter's inheritance, comparable to that of the son, since the greater portion of it is neither owned nor controlled by the girl in her own right. It is really a form of bridegroom price, that is an enticement to the groom's family as part of the settlement of the marriage contract. However, equal rights of inheritance by both son and daughter in one's father's or mother's self-made property is recognized, and same states have even introduced it in their legislation. Matrilineal descent. Matrilineal descent systems, of which there are several well-known examples in southwestern and northeastern India, have their own distinctive characteristics. Empirically, you never find matrilineal systems that are an exact inverse of the patrilineal patriarchal model, which we have already described and which is fairly well approximated by the patrilineal descent systems of North and South, but especially North India. The reason is quite simple. Whatever the descent system, that is matrilineal, patrilineal, or indeed bilateral, authority is usually exercised by males. Only in extremely simple societies one comes across a fair degree of mutual interdependence between males and females. Also, though rights in property might be determined by the principles of matrilineal descent. For instance, passing from mother to daughter or from mother's brother to sister's son, rather than from father to son, as in patrilineal societies. Major property is usually controlled, if not actually owned, by males. For obvious reasons, residence arrangements are problematic in matrilineal societies. A man may not have authority over his own children, who belong to his wife's descent group and who may also reside after maturity with their mother's brother. Conversely, in cases where the husband customarily resides with his wife and children, he may have difficulty managing the property in which he has an interest by virtue of descent and in exercising authority over his sister's children. In other words, there seems to be some sort of contradiction in matrilineal kinship systems brought out in the dilemma over residence between a man's role as father and his role as mother's brother. His natural love for his own children might easily come into conflict with his special dual responsibilities towards his sister's children. Nayars of Kerala. An illustration: among the matrilineal Nayars of Kerala, formerly, men resided in large and matrilineally recruited joint families called Taravad, along with their sisters' children, and sisters' daughters' children. They visited their wives in other Taravads at night. This is why the system has been popularly called the visiting husband system. Their own children resided with their mother in their mother's Taravad. In this system, the bond between brother and sister was strongly emphasized, and the bond between husband and wife correspondingly de-emphasized. This is more so because Nayar women could legitimately have a number of visiting husbands, provided they were of the correct status, that is, higher status Nayars or Nambudiri Brahmins. Also, Nayar men could have a number of wives. In fact, the marital bond was so minimized among the Nayars that sociologists have debated endlessly whether Nayar society had the institution of marriage at all. Sociologists have also cited that the Nayar system disproves the proposition that the elementary or nuclear family is a universal human institution. The details of these debates need not detain us here. Indeed, the unique institutions and customs described by the sociologists no longer exist and have not existed for generations. But the Nayar case is a useful one for illustrating the types of tensions that seem to be coming into matrilineal systems. They had a rather unique way of copying with what sociologists have called the matrilineal puzzle. Effectively, they ensured the unity of the matrilineal at the expense of the solidarity of the marital bond between husband and wife. Other matrilineal communities. There are many other matrilineal communities in India whose kinship organization is rather different to that of the Nayars. For instance, the Khasas of Assam are matrilineal in descent, inheritance and succession, and practice matrilocal residence. The youngest daughter is the heiress and lives in her mother's house alone with her husband and the children. The older daughter, however, may move out of the matrilineal household on marriage and make new nuclear families. Their husbands have greater independent authority than does the husband of the youngest daughter, still residing matrilocally. The Karo, also of Assam, have yet another arrangement. Marriage is matrilocal for the husband of the daughter who becomes the head of the household and its manager. A rule of differential cross-cousin marriage ensures that a man is succeeded in this position by his sister's son in an ongoing alliance relationship between the two linked lineages. Earlier, sociologists working within an evolutionary framework had maintained that the matrilineal descent systems are the surviving traces of an earlier matriarchal or mother right stage in the development of human kinship organization, and that these would automatically give way to patriarchal and then bilateral models. There is no conclusive evidence that this has happened or is currently happening. At least in the Nayar case, it appears that the decline of the Nayar Taravat over the last century has given rise to a wide variety of residential patterns in the area, and it has become exactly like the patrilineal groups in their neighborhood. Sociologists continue to find matrilineal descent groups of special interest, not only because of the ramifications of the matrilineal puzzle referred to above, but also because issues concerning the status of women or gender relations have come very much to the fore in recent years. It may be, as we have stated, that males have authority and exercise control over property in both patrilineal and matrilineal societies. But most scholars working on matrilineal societies and the members of these societies themselves feel that there is nonetheless a qualitative difference in the status of women in matrilineal as against patrilineal societies. Conclusion. Kinship is the relation by the bond of blood, marriage, and includes kindred bonds. It represents one of the basic social institutions. Kinship is universal and in most societies plays a significant role in the socialization of individuals and the maintenance of group solidarity. It is very important in primitive societies and extends its influence on almost all their activities. A.R. Radcliffe Brown defines kinship as a system of dynamic relations between person and person in a community, the behavior of any two persons in any of these relations being regulated in some way and to a greater or less extent by social usage.